Hi there, and welcome. If you love werewolf shifter romance audiobooks, you've come to the right place. Get ready for an unforgettable listening experience filled with passion, danger, and of course, a brooding alpha male who will steal your heart. This audiobook has everything you love about paranormal romance: intense chemistry, thrilling twists, and an action-packed plot that will keep you hooked until the very end. Whether you're here for the tension, the love story, or the mystery, I promise you'll find it all. So sit back, relax, and let this steamy werewolf shifter romance audiobook transport you to a world of love, loyalty, and adventure. You're going to love every second of it. Let's dive in. Chapter 1. The scent of the city was a strange, discordant symphony of burnt coffee, hot asphalt, human sweat. Logan Kane's senses tuned into it all, dissecting the layers like a predator stalking its prey. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel of his black SUV, parked just outside a bustling cafe on 14th and Pine. A rideshare sticker clung to the windshield, a flimsy shield disguising the predator behind the wheel. It was just past 8 on a Thursday morning, and Logan's world was already humming with potential chaos. Passengers would shuffle into his car, filling the space with their petty complaints, overpriced cologne, and, if he was lucky, hints of something far more dangerous. Rogues. Logan sniffed the air. Nothing yet. Just the sour tang of exhaust and the faint, sticky sweetness of cinnamon rolls wafting from the cafe. Ordinary. For now. The rideshare app pinged. Another request. He glanced at the name. M. Carter. "Let's see what kind of morning you're having, Carter," he muttered, swiping to accept Logan's dual life required finesse. The world knew him as a nondescript rideshare driver, a forgettable face in a sea of drivers navigating the city. The pack knew him as something else entirely: the enforcer, the shadowed blade against rogue shifters threatening their secrecy. His position required patience, detachment, and a willingness to make hard calls. Humanity didn't know it, but they were safer because of men like him. 15 minutes later, Logan pulled up outside a glassy high-rise. The passenger, a frazzled man in his 40s wearing a wrinkled suit, juggled a coffee cup and a phone as he climbed in. "Morning," Logan said, his tone neutral, his eyes already flicking to the rearview mirror for clues. "Human, obviously." "Ugh, barely," the man replied, his voice coated in exasperation. "Traffic on the bridge is going to kill me today." Logan resisted the urge to roll his eyes. Humans and their petty grievances. The man jabbered on about deadlines and incompetent co-workers, his voice abuzz in Logan's ears. Logan's focus was elsewhere. Every turn, every pause at a light, his heightened senses stretched, scanning for the unusual. Rogue shifters weren't stupid. They blended in, used their human guises like armor, but their scent always betrayed them eventually. A tang of old blood, wet fur, the smell of decay where life should have been. Not this guy, though. Logan exhaled, faint disappointment threading through his detachment. When they reached the office complex, the man climbed out with a muttered thanks and hustled toward the revolving doors. Logan barely watched him go. His app dinged again. Another passenger. The next 2 hours blurred with monotony. A college student, a chatty retiree, a couple who argued in hushed tones as if the car was soundproof. Logan let them all fade into the background, their words washing over him as he sifted the air for signs of danger. Then, finally, something. The smell hit him when a woman slid into the back seat at a pickup outside a suburban strip mall. She was slight and pale, her black hoodie swallowing her features, but it wasn't her. It was the faint, acrid stink clinging to her clothes, the scent of a rogue. "Where to?" Logan asked, his tone smooth, unbothered. "Just drive," she said, her voice tight. "I'll tell you where to go." Logan's fingers tightened on the wheel, his senses sharpened, his heart slowing to the deliberate rhythm of a hunter. "You in trouble?" he asked casually, pulling into traffic. The woman glanced up, her bloodshot eyes narrowing. "What's it to you?" Logan didn't answer. He didn't need to. Whatever she was running from, or toward, creaked of rogue involvement. For now he drove, memorizing her scent, cataloging every twitch of her nervous fingers and every whispered command to turn left, right, straight. He dropped her off near a boarded-up warehouse, her destination raising every alarm in his gut. But he let her go. For now. The next fare request was a kid. Logan didn't usually drive kids. They were noisy and unpredictable. But the app flagged it as a desperate situation. Single mom, stranded at a gas station with a toddler. Against his better judgment, Logan swiped to accept. When he arrived, the woman was pacing near the curb, cradling a toddler who clung to her like a barnacle. She turned, and her expression softened with relief as Logan rolled down the window. "You're Logan?" she asked. He nodded. "Where to?" "The west side," she said, climbing in. I'll pay as soon as we get there." Logan's first instinct was skepticism. He had seen too many cons in his years to take anyone at face value. But the kid, barely 2, with tear-streaked cheeks and wide, sleepy eyes, wasn't faking exhaustion. Logan pulled into traffic, his jaw tightening. "Bad day?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. The woman gave a shaky laugh. "You could say that. My car broke down, my phone's about to die, and my boss didn't take kindly to me leaving early to pick him up from daycare." She gestured toward the boy, who was now dozing against her shoulder. Logan grunted. He didn't want to care. But as the miles ticked by, he found himself glancing at the rearview mirror more often than necessary. The woman's haggard face. The child's tiny hand gripping her sleeve. When they arrived at a modest apartment complex, the woman fumbled with her purse. Give me a second, I know I have some cash." "Don't worry about it," Logan said, his voice gruff. He looked away as her eyes widened in surprise. "I can't let you—" "Consider it a favor," Logan interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. She hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you, really." She climbed out, the boy stirring against her chest. Logan watched them disappear into the building, a faint, unwelcome warmth blooming in his chest. He shook his head and pulled away. That night, as Logan parked his SUV in the lot outside his sparsely furnished apartment, he couldn't shake the memory of the child's tiny hand. It wasn't his problem. None of it was his problem. But as he stepped inside and locked the door, Logan knew the truth. He could blend into the human world all he wanted. He could pretend to be detached, disinterested, untouchable. But somewhere beneath the surface, the instincts that made him an alpha, the instincts to protect, still burned, and that made him vulnerable. Chapter 2. The car smelled like rain and old leather. Logan adjusted the rearview mirror as the new pickup flashed on his phone. Hannah Pierce, 5 blocks away. It had been a long day of uninspired fares, people griping about office drama, bad relationships, or traffic. But something about this name, Hannah Pierce, caught in Logan's mind like a burr. He flexed his fingers against the steering wheel, shrugging off the feeling, and turned the SUV toward the pickup. The neighborhood wasn't the worst in the city, but it was worn down. Peeling paint on apartment doors, a flickering neon sign over a laundromat. When Logan pulled up to the curb, the woman standing there looked out of place, even among the cracked concrete and dim streetlights. Hannah Pierce was slight, almost swallowed by the oversized gray coat draped over her narrow shoulders. Her dark hair fell across her face like a curtain, hiding her eyes. She clutched a frayed canvas bag with both hands, as if it contained her life. Logan rolled down the window and leaned slightly toward her. "Hannah." She startled, her head snapping up. Wide, dark eyes met his, shimmering with a vulnerability that sent a jolt through Logan's chest. "Yes, sorry." Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper. She opened the back door and slid in, keeping her bag pressed against her lap. Logan's nose twitched. Beneath the faint scent of lavender and wet wool, something else lingered. Not human, not shifter. Something in between. He couldn't place it, and that bothered him. "Where to?" Logan asked, keeping his tone neutral, though his senses were on full alert. Just downtown, 23rd and Park. She glanced at the window, her fingers worrying the strap of her bag. Logan frowned. It wasn't a residential area, just offices, closed-up stores, and the occasional diner. Odd, but not his business. "You got it," he said, easing the SUV into traffic. Silence filled the car, but it wasn't the comfortable kind. It was brittle, tense. Logan could feel her unease radiating like heat, amplified by the sharp, erratic rhythm of her breathing. "You okay?" he asked finally, his voice cutting through the quiet. She froze, her fingers tightening on the bag. "Fine. Why? You seem jumpy." Her head turned slightly, just enough for him to see the curve of her cheek in the rearview mirror. "I'm not," Logan grunted. He'd heard that tone before, defensive, a little too quick. She was hiding something, but he wouldn't press. Not yet. The miles passed in muted tension, the rhythmic hum of tires on wet pavement the only sound. Logan's instincts prickled. Something about her wasn't adding up. The scent he couldn't place, the way she seemed to fold in on herself, like she was bracing for a blow. At a red light, Logan glanced in the mirror again. Her eyes were fixed on the passing streetlights, distant and haunted. Whatever ghosts she was running from, they weren't far behind. When they reached 23rd and Park, Hannah hesitated before opening the door. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice so quiet Logan almost missed it. "No problem," he said, though his tone held a sharp edge of curiosity he didn't bother hiding. She paused, gripping the bag tighter. For a moment it looked like she wanted to say something, her lips parted, but then she shook her head and stepped out into the rain. Logan watched her retreat into the shadows, her coat billowing in the wind, his gut twisted. Something wasn't right. He glanced at the back seat, instinct urging him to check. A scrap of paper peeked out from where she'd been sitting. Frowning, Logan reached back and plucked it up. The notebook page was torn, the edges jagged, the ink smeared from water damage, but the words were clear enough to send a chill down his spine. "No one can find out. If they do, he'll kill me." Logan parked his SUV at the curb, his grip on the scrap of paper tightening. The words burned in his mind like a brand, raising more questions than answers. Who was he? And why did she believe her life depended on staying hidden? For a moment, he considered letting it go. He was no stranger to passengers leaving behind traces of their lives. Half-empty coffee cups, forgotten umbrellas, the occasional phone number scrawled on a receipt. But this wasn't ordinary. Nothing about Hannah Pierce felt ordinary. A light drizzle began to fall, streaking the windshield with silvery trails. Logan sighed, stuffing the note into his jacket pocket. He couldn't do much with it now, but something told him this wasn't the last he'd see of her. His phone buzzed with another fare, another distraction. But as he drove to his next pickup, Hannah's haunted eyes and cryptic note lingered, a knot in the back of his mind he couldn't untangle. The day dragged on in a haze of routine. Passengers came and went, their mundane lives bleeding into the fabric of the city. Logan went through the motions, but his thoughts kept circling back to Hannah. By late afternoon, Logan found himself in a diner on the edge of downtown, sipping black coffee that was more bitterness than caffeine. The note was crumpled in his pocket, the weight of it heavier than it should have been. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Logan glanced up. Max, his longtime confidant and occasional conscience, slid into the booth across from him. "Didn't think I'd find you brooding in a place like this," Max added, gesturing at the cracked vinyl seats and flickering neon sign. Logan leaned back, crossing his arms. "Just passing time." Max arched a brow. Passing time or avoiding something? Logan didn't answer. Instead, he slid the note across the table. Max picked it up, his sharp eyes scanning the smeared ink. "Cryptic, your style." Max's tone was light, but his expression darkened. "Who's it from?" "A passenger." Logan kept his voice steady, but the words felt heavier than they should. "She left it in my car." "And you're thinking about getting involved?" Logan's jaw tightened. She smelled different. Not human, not shifter. Something in between. Max frowned, folding the note and setting it down. If you're right, she's probably trouble, the kind we don't need. Maybe. Logan's gaze flicked to the rain-streaked window. But if I don't figure out what's going on, she's as good as dead. Max studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he sighed. Just don't forget who you are, Logan. You can't save everyone. That night, as Logan climbed into bed, Hannah's face haunted him. Her eyes, her voice, the fragility in the way she held herself. And the words on the note, "No one can find out. If they do, he'll kill me." Sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, it brought dreams of shadows and a woman's whispered plea for help. Chapter 3. The city at night always carried a certain edge, like a predator waiting to pounce. Logan Kane leaned against the hood of his SUV, his sharp gaze sweeping over the empty parking lot outside Ruby's diner. The neon sign buzzed weakly overhead, casting pale red light across the rain-slick asphalt. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He answered without looking, his voice low and clipped. "Talk, you're not going to like this," came the voice of Brandon, one of Logan's more reliable informants. The man had a talent for sniffing out trouble, though his methods were questionable. "When do I ever like what you have to say?" Logan replied, scanning the shadows. Brandon let out a nervous chuckle. "Fair point. Okay, here it is. There's been a spike in rogue activity near Ruby's. Rumor is they're sniffing around for fresh recruits. And not just shifters, humans too. The kind nobody would miss." Logan's jaw tightened. Rogue shifters trafficking humans. It wasn't unheard of, but it was rare and vile. "Who's running it?" Logan asked, his voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath. "Don't know yet, but it's organized, Logan. More than usual, like someone's pulling the strings." Logan's mind flickered the scrap of paper Hannah had left behind. "No one can find out. If they do, he'll kill me." "Anything else?" he asked, keeping his voice casual. Brandon hesitated. "One more thing. Some of the rogues mentioned your name. Sounds like they know you're sniffing around." Logan's lips curved into a grim smile. "Let them know I'm not hard to find." Logan hung up and slipped the phone into his jacket. He crossed the lot toward the diner, his boots splashing through shallow puddles. The scent hit him before he even opened the door, a mix of cheap grease, burnt coffee, and something else, faint but distinct. Rog. The bell over the door jingled as he stepped inside. A tired waitress glanced up from behind the counter, her bored expression faltering when she met Logan's piercing gaze. "Coffee?" she offered weakly. Logan shook his head. "Just passing through." He let his gaze sweep the room. The diner was mostly empty, save for a pair of truckers hunched over their plates and a man in a dark hoodie seated near the back. The man's scent was off, too sharp, too wild. Rogue for sure. Logan slid into a booth 2 tables away, his movements deliberate, his posture relaxed. He was just another tired driver stopping for a break. Or so he wanted the rogue to think. The man shifted in his seat, his fingers drumming against the chipped formica table. Logan watched him from the corner of his eye, cataloging every twitch and shift in his scent. Fear, anxiety, and something darker. The rogue bolted as soon as the waitress turned her back. Logan was on his feet in an instant, his body moving with a predator's precision. He followed the rogue out the back door and into the narrow alley behind the diner, the rain hissing against the asphalt. The rogue didn't get far. Logan caught him by the collar, slamming him against the brick wall with enough force to rattle loose a spray of mortar. "Evening," Logan said, his voice smooth as silk. The rogue snarled, baring sharp teeth. "You don't want to do this, Kane." Logan's grip tightened. "What I want is answers. Who's running the operation?" The rogue sneered, his yellowed eyes gleaming in the dim light. "Wouldn't you like to know?" Logan slammed him against the wall again, harder this time. "Try me." For a moment the rogue looked ready to break, but then his lips twisted into a grin, his gaze turning sharp with malice. "You think you can protect them, don't you? Your precious humans. He spat the word like a curse. But you can't. They're weak, breakable, just like her. Logan's heart skipped. Her who? The rogue's grin widened. Hannah! A growl rumbled deep in Logan's chest. His fingers tightened on the rogue's collar, lifting him clear off the ground. What do you know about her? Logan demanded, his voice a low snarl. She's marked, the rogue rasped, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Cade wants her, and what Cade wants, he gets. Logan's blood turned cold. Cade. The name alone was enough to make his teeth clench. Cade was no ordinary rogue. He was a monster in every sense of the word, a predator who thrived on chaos and cruelty. If Cade was involved, this was bigger than Logan had feared. Where is he? Logan growled. The rogue laughed, the sound wet and rattling. You'll see him soon enough. Logan's patience snapped. With a single motion, he slammed the rogue to the ground, knocking him unconscious. If he didn't, the alley was silent except for the steady patter of rain. Logan stared down at the crumpled rogue, his mind racing. Cade, Hannah, human trafficking. It was all connected, and Logan was standing at the center of the web. He clenched his fists, forcing his emotions under control. There was no time for doubt or hesitation. If Cade was after Hannah, she was in more danger than he'd realized, and Logan had no intention of letting Cade win. Chapter 4. The apartment was quiet except for the low hum of the fridge and the occasional drip from the kitchen faucet. Logan stood by the window, his silhouette outlined against the city's faint glow. Rain spattered against the glass, rhythmic and soothing, but Logan's mind churned with thoughts far from tranquil. Hannah Pierce. Her name was an anchor in his brain, tethering his thoughts even when he tried to cast them aside. She wasn't the first person to stumble into his path with more secrets than sense. But there was something about her, something that made him linger over the memory of her haunted eyes and the cryptic note she'd left behind. He told himself it was strategy. Her connection to the rogues couldn't be ignored. But deep down, in a place he rarely allowed himself to visit, he felt a pull he couldn't quite explain. Logan shook his head and turned away from the window. He couldn't afford distractions, especially not now. The sound of his phone vibrating against the counter broke the silence. Logan snatched it up, the name on the screen drawing a low growl from his throat. Micah. He pressed accept, his voice sharp. What do you want? Micah's voice was smooth, almost amused. Nice to hear from you too, Kane. Thought you might want to know your little solo act is stirring up some chatter. Logan clenched his jaw. Micah was the alpha of a neighboring pack, a political animal who thrived on posturing and power plays. Their conversations were always a dance of veiled barbs and mutual disdain. I'm not in the mood for games, Logan said. Get to the point. Fine, Micah's tone hardened. Word is you've been poking around rogue territory, stirring the pot. Someone has to, Logan shot back. Since you're too busy babysitting your precious counsel, Micah chuckled, but the sound lacked humor. Careful, Kane. You might think you're above pack politics, but your little rogue problem, it's not just yours anymore. Logan stiffened. What are you saying? I'm saying there's a line, and you're about to cross it. Stay in your lane, or the council will make sure you regret it. The line went dead before Logan could respond. He tossed the phone onto the counter, his teeth bared in frustration. Micah's warning was typical. Posturing, threats, the usual politics. But the mention of the council's involvement set Logan's nerves on edge. If they were watching, it meant the situation with the rogues was bigger than he'd realized. Logan didn't sleep that night. Instead, he pored over the scraps of information he'd gathered about Hannah Pierce, her address, her workplace, the disconnected phone number tied to her rideshare account. Every piece of data painted the picture of a woman living on the edge, running from something, or someone. The note she'd left hinted at an abusive ex, and Logan's instincts told him the man was more than just a regular scumbag. He tapped into his network, using old favors and backdoor channels to dig deeper. By morning, the picture was clearer. And uglier. Hannah's ex-boyfriend, Marcus Rivera, wasn't just bad news. He was tangled up in the kind of criminal web that made Logan's blood run cold: drug trafficking, illegal fights, and, most disturbingly, connections to rogue shifters. It wasn't a coincidence. Couldn't be. Logan leaned back in his chair, the weight of the revelation settling on his shoulders. Hannah hadn't just stumbled into his world. She'd been dragged into it, kicking and screaming. And now, she was in the crosshairs of people who didn't care who they had to hurt to get what they wanted. The afternoon found Logan parked outside a dingy warehouse on the city's outskirts. The address had come up during his digging, a location tied to Marcus's dealings. The air was thick with the metallic scent of rain and rust. Logan stepped out of his SUV, his boots crunching against gravel as he approached the warehouse. His senses stretched, searching for movement, sound, scent. Inside, the air was stale and heavy with the stink of sweat and old blood. Logan's lip curled in disgust as he moved through the shadowed space, his footsteps silent. He found what he was looking for in a back room. A table cluttered with papers, photos, and a laptop left open but powered off. One photo caught his attention. It was grainy and slightly blurred, but there was no mistaking the subject. Hannah. She was caught mid-step, her face partially obscured by her hair. The sight of her, so small and vulnerable in the frame, sent a wave of anger through Logan. His eyes narrowed as he sifted through the rest of the clutter. Names, addresses, dates. A map of the city with certain locations marked in red. This wasn't just about her ex. This was organized, systematic. Logan pocketed the photo and some of the documents before slipping out the way he came. By the time Logan returned to his SUV, the rain had turned into a steady downpour. He climbed into the driver's seat, tossing the stolen papers onto the passenger seat. Before he could start the engine, a figure stepped into the edge of his vision. Logan's head snapped toward the movement, his muscles tensing. The man was lean and wiry, his clothes soaked from the rain. His face was pale, his eyes gleaming with the faint feral glow of a rogue. "You've got guts, Kane," the rogue said, his voice carrying easily over the rain. Logan rolled down the window just enough to speak. "And you've got about 5 seconds to tell me why I shouldn't put you through that wall." The rogue grinned, sharp and toothy. "Cade sends his regards." Logan was out of the car in an instant, his hand gripping the rogue's shirt and slamming him against the nearest wall. "What does Cade want with her?" Logan growled, his voice low and dangerous. The rogue laughed, the sound hollow and taunting. "You really think you can protect her? She's marked. She belongs to us now." Logan's claws extended, his teeth elongating as his wolf threatened to surface. "She doesn't belong to anyone," he snarled. The rogue's grin faltered, his eyes widening as Logan's aura pressed against him like a physical weight. "You tell Cade to stay away," Logan said, his voice sharp and cold. "Or I'll bring the fight to him." He released the rogue, letting him crumple to the ground. The man scrambled away, casting one last fearful glance at Logan before disappearing into the rain. Back in his SUV, Logan stared at the photo of Hannah, his jaw tight. The stakes were higher now. Cade wasn't just after her. He was making it personal. Logan clenched his fists. He didn't know what game Cade was playing, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just about rogues or territory. It was about Hannah. And Logan wasn't about to let her face it alone. Chapter 5. The rain had tapered off to a faint drizzle, leaving the air cool and heavy. Logan leaned against the hood of his SUV, parked inconspicuously across the street from the laundromat. From here, he had a clear view of the small diner next door, where Hannah was seated in a corner booth, nursing a cup of tea. She looked smaller in the fluorescent light, her frame hunched like she was trying to disappear into the vinyl cushions. The hood of her sweatshirt hung low over her face, shielding her from the world, or maybe just from whoever she thought was still hunting her. Logan didn't move, didn't blink. He told himself he was here because of the rogues. She was a loose thread, and if Cade was involved, that thread could unravel into something dangerous. He wasn't here because he cared. His jaw tightened at the thought. Caring was a luxury, one he'd abandoned long ago. A man in a leather jacket sauntered into the diner, his boots squeaking against the linoleum. Logan's sharp eyes tracked him as he paused just inside the door, scanning the room. Something about the man's scent prickled Logan's senses. It was subtle, but wrong, like spoiled meat masked by cologne. The man's gaze landed on Hannah, and Logan stiffened as he watched him slide into the booth across from her uninvited. Hannah flinched. Logan's chest tightened. Through the rain-smeared window, Logan watched the interaction. The man leaned in too close, his body language all predatory arrogance. Hannah shrank back, her shoulders curving inward like she was trying to fold herself into nothing. Logan's hand hovered over the door handle. He could be there in seconds, could have the guy pinned against the wall before anyone noticed. But he didn't move. This wasn't his fight. Human squabbles weren't his concern, and Hannah wasn't his responsibility. He was here to track rogues, not play knight in shining armor. The man reached across the table, grabbing Hannah's wrist. Her head jerked up, her face twisting in fear. Logan's restraint snapped. The diner bell jingled as Logan pushed through the door, his imposing frame filling the entryway. Every head turned to him, but he only had eyes for the man in the leather jacket. "Let her go," Logan said, his voice calm but laced with steel. The man turned slowly, a smirk playing across his lips. "And who the hell are you?" Logan took a step closer, his movements deliberate. The man didn't let go, but Logan saw the hesitation in his eyes, the flicker of recognition. "I said," Logan repeated, his voice dropping into a growl, "let her go." Hannah's wide eyes flicked to Logan, her lips parting as if to speak, but the man released her wrist, leaning back with a sneer. "Relax, big guy. Just having a friendly chat." Logan didn't respond. His icy stare pinned the man in place, until he rose from the booth and sauntered toward the exit. "You've got no idea what you're getting into," the man muttered as he passed Logan. Logan's lips curled into a faint, humorless smile. "Neither do you." Once the man was gone, Logan turned to Hannah. She was trembling, her hands clasped tightly around her mug. "You okay?" he asked, keeping his voice softer than usual. She nodded, but it was unconvincing. "He just wouldn't leave me alone, thank you." Logan studied her for a moment, his gaze flicking to the faint red marks on her wrist. Anger stirred in his chest, but he pushed it down. "Do you know him?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, he just came in and sat down." Logan didn't believe her, but he didn't press. "Stay here. Don't go anywhere until you're sure he's gone." She looked like she wanted to argue but nodded instead. "Okay." Logan left without another word. The alley behind the diner was narrow and dimly lit, the smell of wet garbage thick in the air. Logan caught the man's scent immediately, stronger now, unmistakably rogue. Logan's fists clenched as he followed the trail. He found the man leaning against a dumpster, lighting a cigarette. "You've got guts," Logan said, his voice carrying easily over the rain. The man jumped, his cigarette falling to the ground. He recovered quickly, though, his smirk returning as he straightened. "Back for more?" the rogue taunted. Logan closed the distance in 2 strides, slamming the rogue against the brick wall. "Who sent you?" Logan growled. The rogue's grin widened. "You already know the answer to that." "Cade," Logan said, his teeth bared. "Smart dog," the rogue sneered. "But you're out of your league. Cade's got plans, and you're just a loose end." Logan's patience snapped. His fist connected with the rogue's jaw, sending him sprawling to the ground. The rogue laughed, blood dripping from his split lip. "You can't save her, Kane. You'll never save any of them." Logan froze, his chest heaving. The words hit deeper than they should have, striking at a truth he rarely allowed himself to face. "You don't know anything about me," Logan snarled. The rogue chuckled darkly. "Don't I? You're just like the rest of us, alone, empty, waiting for the day you finally give in." Logan silenced him with another blow, the rogue's head snapping back against the pavement. Logan staggered away, his breathing ragged. The rogue's body lay still, the rain washing away the blood pooling beneath him. Logan leaned against the wall, his fists trembling. The rogue's words echoed in his mind. Alone. Empty. It wasn't the first time someone had said it, and it wasn't the first time it felt true. Logan stared at his hands, scarred and stained. He'd told himself he was fine with this life, detached, distant, unburdened by the weight of connections, but deep down, he knew the truth. If he kept walking this path, he'd die alone, and for the first time, the thought scared him. Chapter 6. The night was quiet except for the distant hum of streetlights and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. Hannah stepped out of the small bookstore where she worked part-time, her canvas bag slung over her shoulder. The shop's lights blinked off behind her, plunging the street into darkness. She glanced over her shoulder, a habit she couldn't seem to shake, and quickened her pace. Her shoes tapped against the pavement, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. Logan sat in his SUV a block away, watching her from the shadows. She shouldn't have been out here alone. The city might have seemed peaceful to most, but Logan knew better. The scent of rogues was in the air, faint but unmistakable. His fingers tightened on the steering wheel. He told himself he was here for reconnaissance, nothing more. Protecting Hannah wasn't his job. She wasn't Pack. But when her silhouette disappeared around a corner, his instincts screamed. The attack came fast. 3 figures emerged from the shadows as Hannah turned down the alley that led to her bus stop. At first, she thought they were just loitering, but the moment one of them stepped into her path, she knew she was in trouble. "Evening, sweetheart," the man said, his voice dripping with malice. Hannah froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I don't want any trouble," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "Trouble?" The man grinned, showing teeth that were just a little too sharp. "You're the one who brought it, love." The others closed in behind her, blocking her escape. Panic rose in her chest as she backed away, clutching her bag like a shield. Logan's growl cut through the night like a blade. The rogues turned, their eyes narrowing as Logan strode into the alley, his presence filling the space like a storm cloud. Leave," Logan said, his voice low and deadly. The leader of the group sneered. "Or what? You'll bark at us?" Logan didn't bother replying. He moved faster than humanly possible and slammed the rogue into the brick wall with a bone-rattling thud. The others lunged at him, but Logan was ready, his claws extended, a sharp metallic gleam in the moonlight. The fight was brutal and quick, Logan's movements precise and efficient. When the last rogue hit the ground, Logan stood over him, his chest heaving, his eyes glowing with primal fury. Hannah pressed herself against the wall, her breath shallow as she stared at Logan. She couldn't finish the sentence. Her mind refused to make sense of what she'd just seen. Logan turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "You're safe now." She shook her head, her voice trembling. "What are you?" Logan hesitated. He could lie, could spin some story and disappear into the night, but looking into her wide, terrified eyes, he found himself saying, "Not the enemy." They walked in silence toward her apartment, the tension between them thick and unspoken. Hannah finally broke it. "Why were they after me?" Logan glanced at her, weighing his words carefully. "They're part of something bigger, and you're caught in the middle of it." She stopped walking, her hand gripping his arm. "You're not telling me everything." Logan met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "No, I'm not." "Well," she demanded, her voice breaking. "Because the less you know, the safer you'll be," Logan said, his tone firm but not unkind. Her hand fell away and she looked down. "I don't feel safe." Logan's chest tightened at her words. He wanted to promise her that she would be, that he wouldn't let anything happen to her, but he didn't trust himself to keep that promise. When they reached her apartment, Hannah hesitated at the door. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely audible. Logan nodded, his throat tight. "Get some rest, keep the door locked." She disappeared inside, and Logan lingered for a moment, staring at the door. As he turned to leave, the faint bond tugging at his chest tightened, like a thread tying him to her. His alpha instincts had latched onto her, creating a connection he hadn't wanted or expected. It was dangerous for both of them. But as Logan walked away, he knew he couldn't ignore it. Not anymore. Chapter 7. The rain had returned by morning, drumming steadily against the windows of Hannah's small apartment. She sat at the kitchen table, her tea growing cold, her thoughts racing. Logan's words from the night before echoed in her mind. You're caught in the middle of something bigger. What did that mean? And more importantly, what was he? She touched her wrist, where the rogue's grip had left faint bruises. Her memory of the attack was hazy, but Logan's intervention stood out sharply. His impossible speed, the way his eyes had glowed in the dim light. A shiver ran down her spine. Hannah wasn't sure if she should be afraid of him or grateful. Maybe both. Logan stood in the alley behind a shuttered cafe, pacing. His boots splashed in the shallow puddles, but he barely noticed. His wolf was restless, clawing at the edges of his control, demanding action. Hannah had been terrified last night. Of the rogues, yes, but also of him. He could see it in her wide eyes, the way she'd recoiled when he'd approached her. He couldn't blame her. He was a predator, after all, and humans instinctively feared predators. But he'd also seen something else in her eyes. Something that twisted his gut. Trust. Fragile and unspoken, but there nonetheless. Logan stopped pacing, running a hand through his hair. Protecting her was the right thing to do, but the more he got involved, the closer he came to crossing a line he couldn't uncross. The sharp scent of pine and earth hit Logan's nose a moment before the familiar voice broke the silence. You've been busy. Logan turned to see Micah leaning casually against the wall, his arms crossed. The rival alpha looked as smug as ever, his sharp features set in a smirk that made Logan's fists itch. What do you want, Micah? Logan asked, his voice low. Micah shrugged. Word travels fast. You've got a human in your orbit. Cute, too, from what I hear. Logan's jaw tightened. Stay out of it. I would, but it's not that simple, Micah said, pushing off the wall and stepping closer. You know the rules, Kane. Involving yourself with humans is messy, it draws attention, and attention is dangerous for all of us. She's caught up in something she doesn't understand, Logan snapped. It's not her fault. Doesn't matter, Micah said, his tone hardening. If she's tied to Cade, she's a liability, and liabilities get people killed. Logan took a step forward, his chest brushing Micah's. Are you threatening her? Micah held his ground, his smirk fading. No, but the council might, if you don't handle this. Logan's wolf surged beneath his skin, but he forced it down. Micah wasn't worth losing control over. Not yet. You tell the council to stay out of my business, Logan growled. I'll handle Cade. And Hannah. Micah raised an eyebrow. Just remember, Kane, protecting humans comes with a price. Make sure she's worth it. Logan didn't respond, and Micah disappeared into the shadows, leaving the scent of pine and condescension in his wake. Hannah jumped when Logan knocked on her door. She wasn't sure if it was because of the unexpected sound or the man on the other side of it. Logan, she said, opening the door just wide enough to peer out. We need to talk, he said, his voice gruff. Hannah hesitated, then stepped aside to let him in. Logan filled the small space, his presence overwhelming in a way that was equal parts intimidating and reassuring. She crossed her arms, trying to mask her nerves. What's going on? Last night? What were those people? Logan sighed, his broad shoulders rising and falling. He'd known this moment was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. They weren't people, he said finally. Not entirely. Hannah blinked, her brow furrowing. What does that mean? Logan met her gaze, his expression steady but serious. Sometimes, Logan met her gaze, his expression steady but serious. They were rogues. Shifters who've turned their backs on the pack system. They're dangerous and unpredictable. "And you're one of them? A shifter?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Logan admitted, his voice firm. "But I'm not like them. I don't hurt people." Hannah looked away, her thoughts spinning. "Why were they after me?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Logan said. "But I need you to be honest with me, Hannah. Are you tied to anyone who might have connections to the rogues?" Her breath hitched, and she looked down at her hands. She said quietly. "Marcus. He's not a good person." Logan's jaw clenched. He'd suspected as much, but hearing her say it stirred a fierce protective instinct in him. "Did he hurt you?" Logan asked, his voice low but dangerous. Hannah hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." Logan's fists tightened at his sides. "He's connected to the rogues. I've seen the evidence." Hannah's eyes widened. "What? How?" "It doesn't matter," Logan said. "What matters is that you're in danger because of him, and I'm not going to let them get to you." Hannah's lips parted in surprise. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." Logan hesitated, his gaze softening. "Because I can." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. By the time Logan left Hannah's apartment, the rain had stopped, leaving the city slick and glistening under the streetlights. He knew what he was getting into. Helping Hannah meant crossing lines he'd carefully avoided for years. It meant drawing Cade's attention and putting himself and his pack at risk. But as he looked back at her window, the faint glow of light spilling through the curtains, he knew he couldn't walk away. No matter the cost, he would protect her. And that terrified him more than anything else. Chapter 8. The sun barely peeked through the heavy canopy of clouds as Logan drove toward the outskirts of the city. The roads here were quieter, winding through patches of forest that encroached on the urban sprawl. The isolation suited Max, a man who had long since traded the chaos of pack life for the solitude of the wild. Logan's SUV crunched to a stop on the gravel driveway of a cabin that was as much a fortress as it was a home. The structure was rugged, its walls made of thick, weathered logs, with no withered windows that gleamed faintly in the morning light. Max was already outside, his arms crossed over his broad chest, watching Logan with a knowing smirk. "Thought you might show up," Max called as Logan stepped out of the vehicle. His voice was deep and smooth, with a trace of an accent that hinted at roots far older than his appearance let on. Logan slammed the door shut and crossed the distance between them. "You hear about Cade?" Max's smirk faded, replaced by a serious expression. "I hear everything, Kane, and I've been waiting for you to get your head out of the clouds and come talk to me." Logan bristled. "I don't need a lecture, Max." "You always do," Max replied, his tone lighter than the words. "Come on, coffee's hot." The cabin's interior was just as practical as its exterior. The furniture was sturdy, worn, and devoid of unnecessary decoration. Maps and books were scattered across the large wooden table in the center of the room, along with a mug of steaming coffee that Max slid toward Logan as they sat down. "So," Max began, leaning back in his chair, "what's the story with this human everyone's buzzing about?" Logan frowned, wrapping his hands around the mug but not drinking. "She's tied to Cade's network, probably without realizing it. Her ex is in deep, and the rogues are using her as bait or leverage. Either way, she's a target." Max's eyes narrowed. "And you've made it your mission to protect her?" "She doesn't deserve to get caught in the crossfire," Logan said, his voice tight. Max tilted his head, studying Logan. "That all there is to it?" Logan's jaw clenched, but he didn't answer. Max sighed, his tone softening. "You've always had a bleeding heart under all that gruff exterior, Kane. But this? Getting involved with humans on this level? It's dangerous." "You think I don't know that?" Logan snapped. "Every rogue in the city is looking for her, and if Cade gets his hands on her—" "You'll blame yourself," Max interrupted. "That's the problem, Logan. You're so busy trying to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders that you can't see the cracks forming beneath your feet." Logan looked away, his throat tightening. I can handle it. Max leaned forward, his expression stern but not unkind. Can you? Or are you just pretending you can because you don't know how to ask for help? The words hit harder than Logan wanted to admit. He stared into his coffee, his reflection rippling in the dark liquid. Max had a way of cutting through the noise, hitting the truth like a blade slicing clean. I don't have a choice, Logan said finally. If I don't protect her, who will? Max nodded slowly. Fair enough. But if you're going to do this, you'd better be prepared for the fallout. The council won't look kindly on it, and neither will Cade. You're painting a target on your back, and hers. I know, Logan said quietly. Good, Max said, his tone sharp again. Then let me give you something to even the odds. Max rose and moved to a cabinet, pulling out a leather-bound notebook and a small, ornate dagger with intricate carvings etched along its hilt. He placed them on the table in front of Logan. The notebook's got intel on Cade's movements and his known associates, Max explained. Some of it's old, but it might give you a starting point. And the dagger? Let's just say it's not your run-of-the-mill blade. Silver-coated, reinforced with wolfsbane. It'll slow down even the nastiest of rogues. Logan picked up the dagger, its weight solid and reassuring in his hand. Why didn't you lead with this? He asked, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Max chuckled. Because you needed to hear the lecture first. As Logan rose to leave, Max placed a hand on his shoulder. One more thing, Max said, his tone grave. I know you think you're doing this for her, but don't kid yourself. This is about you too, Logan frowned. What's that supposed to mean? You've been running from yourself for years, Max said, hiding behind your duty, your rules, your walls. But this girl, she's forcing you to feel something again. That's not a bad thing, but if you're not careful, it'll tear you apart. Logan stiffened, but didn't pull away. Just be honest with yourself, Max added. That's all I'm saying. The drive back to the city was quiet, the dagger and notebook sitting on the passenger seat. Max's words echoed in Logan's mind, stirring something deep and uncomfortable. He wasn't ready to face the truth Max had hinted at, not yet. But as the city lights came into view, Logan knew one thing for certain. He couldn't walk away from this. Not from Hannah. Not from the fight. And for the first time in a long time, that thought didn't scare him as much as it should have. Chapter 9. The air in Logan's apartment was thick with the weight of his decision. The curtains were drawn, shutting out the evening light, leaving the room bathed in the muted glow of a single lamp. He stared at the photo of Hannah he'd taken from the rogue's hideout, her blurred figure in mid-step. She'd become a complication, a distraction. Logan tossed the photo onto the table and leaned back in his chair, scrubbing a hand over his face. He needed to focus on the bigger picture. Tracking Cade, dismantling the rogue network, protecting the city. Protecting her had never been part of the plan, but the thought of stepping back, leaving her to fend for herself, twisted something deep in his chest. She's not your problem, he told himself. You don't owe her anything. His wolf growled in protest, a low rumble that echoed in his mind. The sound of distant voices pulled Logan from his thoughts. He rose and moved to the window, peering down at the street below. Hannah was standing outside her building, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as she spoke to a man in a rumpled jacket. Logan's sharp eyes caught the tension in her posture, the way her fingers gripped the strap of her bag. The man stepped closer, gesturing with a sharpness that made Logan's hackles rise, his fists clenched as he watched. He should let it play out. She'd said she wanted space, and he'd told himself he'd give it to her. But then Hannah flinched, taking a step back. Logan was out the door before he realized what he was doing. Is there a problem here? Logan's voice cut through the night like a blade, sharp and commanding. The man turned, his glare faltering when he saw Logan's towering frame. Who the hell are you? Someone who doesn't like seeing women harassed, Logan replied, his tone even but laced with warning. The man scoffed, but took a step back. Whatever, I'm done here. He slinked off into the night, throwing a glance over his shoulder before disappearing around the corner. Hannah stared after him, her shoulders sagging with relief. "Are you okay?" Logan asked, his voice softening. She nodded, but her hands were trembling. "He's just some guy who hangs around here. I don't know what he wanted." Logan frowned. "You shouldn't be out here alone," Hannah bristled, her gaze snapping to his. "I can take care of myself." "I'm sure you can," Logan said, his tone gentler now. "But that doesn't mean you have to." Hannah's defiance faltered and she looked away. "Why are you even here?" Logan hesitated. He could have lied, could have made up an excuse, but instead he said, "Because I couldn't stay away." They ended up on the steps outside her building, the chill of the evening air making her shiver despite the sweater she wore. "I don't understand any of this," Hannah admitted, her voice low. "The rogues, Cade, you. It's like I'm in the middle of a nightmare I can't wake up from." Logan's chest tightened. "I wish I could tell you it's going to get easier," he said. "But I can promise you this. You're not alone in it." Hannah looked at him, her expression a mix of confusion and gratitude. "Why me? Why are they after me?" Logan debated how much to reveal. Finally he said, "Your ex is tied to them. Whether you knew it or not, being close to him put you on their radar." Hannah's face paled. I didn't know. He wasn't a good person, but I didn't think he was." Her voice cracked, and she hugged herself tightly. Logan's instincts screamed to comfort her, but he held back, his own fear of crossing a line keeping him rooted. "You don't have to explain," he said. "What matters is what we do now." Hannah looked up at him, her eyes glassy but determined. "What can we do?" Logan hesitated. Every part of him wanted to pull away, to tell her to run as far from him and this mess as she could, but the bond tugging at his chest was undeniable, his wolf refusing to let him leave her unprotected. "We start by keeping you safe," he said finally, "and by figuring out how to make sure they can't use you against us." The night deepened, and as they sat in the quiet of the city, Logan felt the weight of his decision settle on his shoulders. He couldn't keep her at arm's length anymore, no matter how much he wanted to. But committing to this, to her, meant more than just protecting her. It meant opening himself up to the vulnerabilities he'd spent years avoiding. And that terrified him more than anything else. Chapter 10. The quiet hymn of Hannah's temporary shelter was broken only by the faint hiss of water running through old pipes. She sat cross-legged on the worn couch, the remnants of her dinner pushed to the edge of the coffee table. Logan stood by the window, his broad shoulders framed by the glow of the street lamp outside. He'd barely spoken since they arrived, his attention fixed on the street below. Every now and then, his sharp eyes flicked to the shadows, his senses straining. "You're making me nervous," Hannah said, her voice cutting through the silence. Logan didn't turn. "Good, you should be." Hannah frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you're not safe here," Logan replied, finally looking at her. His expression was hard, his tone sharper than he intended. Her shoulders stiffened. "You keep saying that, but you're not telling me why." Logan sighed, running a hand through his hair. He knew she deserved answers, but the truth was a tangled web, and pulling one thread would unravel everything. "Because your ex-boyfriend got involved with people who don't care who they hurt to get what they want," Logan said finally. "And now they think you're part of the equation." Hannah's face paled. "I don't know anything about his business. I left him months ago." "Doesn't matter," Logan said. "To them, you're leverage." The conversation was cut short by the sharp sound of glass shattering. Logan's head snapped toward the front door just as a shadow moved outside the window. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice low and commanding. Before Hannah could respond, the door burst open and two figures surged into the room, their movements too quick to be human. Rogues. Logan met the first one head-on, his fist connecting with a sickening crack that sent the rogue crashing into the wall. The second lunged at Hannah, but Logan intercepted, his claws slicing through the air. "Get out, now!" Logan shouted, his voice a growl. Hannah scrambled toward the back door, her heart hammering as chaos erupted around her. She barely made it to the alley when a third rogue appeared, blocking her path. She froze, panic seizing her chest. But before the rogue could strike, Logan was there. A blur of motion and fury, he tackled the rogue to the ground, his teeth bared in a feral snarl. The fight was brutal. Logan's strength and speed gave him the upper hand, but the rogues fought with desperation, their movements erratic and wild. By the time the last one fell, the alley was silent, except for the sound of Logan's ragged breathing. Hannah pressed herself against the wall, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. What are you?" she whispered. Logan turned to her, his chest heaving, his eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "Someone who's trying to keep you alive." They didn't have time to linger. Logan pulled Hannah to her feet, his grip firm but not unkind. "We need to go," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Where?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Somewhere they can't find us," Logan said. "But you have to trust me." Hannah hesitated, then nodded. Logan led her to his SUV, his senses on high alert. As they drove through the city, the weight of the night pressed down on him. He'd crossed a line tonight, one he couldn't uncross. Protecting her wasn't just about honor or duty anymore. It was personal. By the time they reached the edge of the city, dawn was beginning to break, painting the horizon in shades of orange and pink. Logan pulled over, his hands gripping the steering wheel. "This isn't going to get easier," he said, his voice quiet. "If you stay with me, you'll be in danger." "Always." Hannah looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You saved my life," she said. "I'm not leaving now." Logan's chest tightened. The bond between them, unspoken but undeniable, was stronger than ever. And for the first time, he allowed himself to accept it. There was no turning back. Chapter 11. The SUV rumbled along the dirt road, its headlights cutting through the dense fog that rolled over the hills. Hannah sat in the passenger seat, her arms folded tightly across her chest. She hadn't spoken much since they'd left the city. Logan's hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles pale against the black leather. The silence between them was heavy, punctuated only by the steady hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves brushing against the windows. He'd told her they were heading to a safe place, far from the rogue's reach. But the tension in his jaw and the constant flick of his eyes to the rearview mirror suggested otherwise. "Are we almost there?" Hannah asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "Another mile or two," Logan replied, his tone clipped. Hannah turned her gaze to the window, watching the trees blur past. "You don't have to do this, you know." Logan's grip on the wheel tightened. "Do what?" "Protect me," she said, her voice firmer now. "I'm not your responsibility." Logan exhaled sharply, his eyes fixed on the road. "You're right, you're not. But that doesn't mean I'm going to let them hurt you." The cabin appeared suddenly, nestled among the towering pines like a secret whispered into the forest. Its weathered exterior blended with the landscape, its windows dark and uninviting. Hannah hesitated as Logan cut the engine and climbed out, his movements fluid and precise. He opened the door for her, his gaze scanning the woods as she stepped onto the gravel driveway. "This is it?" she asked, her voice tinged with doubt. "It's safe," Logan said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He led her inside, the cabin's interior as sparse as its exterior. The main room held a fireplace, a worn couch, and a small kitchen tucked into one corner. A hallway led to what she assumed were the bedrooms. Hannah set her bag on the floor, the weight of the day pressing down on her. "You'll sleep in the room at the end of the hall," Logan said, breaking the silence. "It locks from the inside." Hannah raised an eyebrow. "Expecting trouble?" "Always," Logan replied, his expression unreadable. She sighed, leaning against the back of the couch. "Do you ever relax?" Logan's lips twitched, a hint of a smile ghosting across his face. "Not often." For a moment, the tension between them softened, the air thick with something unspoken. Later, as Logan moved through the cabin, he began setting things in place, checking the windows, bolting the doors, and securing the perimeter. Hannah watched him from the couch, her arms wrapped around her knees. "You've done this before," she said. Logan paused, glancing at her. "Done what?" "Protected people, set up defenses like this." Logan's jaw tightened and he returned to his work. "It's part of the job." Hannah studied him, her gaze lingering on the sharp lines of his profile. "What exactly is your job, Logan?" He didn't answer immediately, his hands pausing on the lock. "Keeping people like them away from people like you?" As the night deepened, Logan laid out the rules. "Stay inside unless I'm with you," he said, his tone firm. "Don't open the door for anyone, and keep your phone charged. If something feels off, you call me. Understand?" Hannah nodded, but her frown betrayed her frustration. "What happens if you're not here when something feels off?" "I'll be here," Logan said, his voice steady. The certainty in his tone made her chest tighten. She wanted to trust him, more than she cared to admit. But the walls she'd built around herself refused to crumble so easily. Hours later, Logan sat by the fireplace, the flickering flames casting shadows across his face. He stared into the fire, his thoughts a tangled web of doubts and instincts. He'd sworn to himself that he wouldn't get attached, that he'd see this through and walk away, but as the bond between them tightened with every passing moment, he knew it was already too late. Upstairs, Hannah lay awake, her gaze fixed on the ceiling. Her mind churned with questions, fears, and a faint, stubborn hope that she couldn't quite extinguish. Neither of them could see the path ahead, but one thing was certain: their lives would never be the same. Chapter 12. The morning sun filtered through the dense pines surrounding the cabin, casting long golden streaks across the wooden floor. Logan stood on the porch, phone pressed to his ear, his jaw tight as he listened to the low rumble of Max's voice. "Are you sure about this?" Max asked, his tone skeptical. "I wouldn't be calling you if I wasn't," Logan replied, his voice sharper than he intended. "Fine," Max said with a resigned sigh. "But I'm coming to you. I want to see this girl for myself." Logan's stomach twisted at the thought. Max wasn't one for subtlety, and Hannah was already skittish enough, but Logan didn't argue. Max's expertise and experience outweighed his gruffness, and if anyone could help untangle the mess they were in, it was him. "Just get here soon," Logan said, hanging up before Max could respond. Inside, Hannah sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. She looked up as Logan entered, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You've been pacing outside for 20 minutes, she said. "What's going on?" Logan hesitated. "I called someone, a friend." Her brow furrowed. "Why?" "Because we need help," Logan admitted, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her. "He knows the rogues better than anyone. If we're going to stop them, I need him on our side." Hannah frowned, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. "And he's okay with all of this?" "He'll be thorough," Logan said. "But he's not the enemy." Hannah didn't look convinced, but she didn't press further. By midday, the sound of tires crunching on gravel announced Max's arrival. Logan stepped out to greet him, his posture tense. Max climbed out of an old Jeep, his broad frame and sharp eyes making him an imposing figure. His salt and pepper hair caught the sunlight, and his weathered face was set in its usual expression of calm scrutiny. "So," Max said, his gaze sweeping the cabin before settling on Logan. "Where's the damsel in distress?" Logan scowled. "Don't start." Max chuckled, but followed Logan inside without further comment. Hannah stood as they entered, her body language wary. Max's sharp eyes flicked to her, studying her like a puzzle he intended to solve. "Hannah, this is Max," Logan said. "Max, Hannah." "Pleasure," Max said, his voice gruff but not unkind. Hannah nodded, her fingers tightening around the back of the chair. "Logan says you can help." "I can try," Max replied, crossing his arms. But I need to know what we're dealing with. Tell me everything." The conversation that followed was tense. Hannah recounted her connection to Marcus, her ex-boyfriend, and the rogues. Her voice wavered at times, but she pushed through, determined not to appear weak. Max listened intently, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "She's in deeper than I thought," Max said, turning to Logan. "She's not in it by choice," Logan shot back. Max raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. Instead, he pulled out a small notebook and began jotting down notes. "We'll need to move quickly," Max said. "The rogues won't stop until they get what they want, and if Cade's involved—" He trailed off, his tone dark. Logan nodded. "I know." As the day wore on, Max set about fortifying the cabin, his movements efficient and practiced. Hannah watched him work, her unease slowly giving way to curiosity. "You've done this before?" she said. Max glanced at her, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "Once or twice." "You seem different from Logan," she ventured. Max chuckled. "Logan's a good man, stubborn as hell, but good. He just doesn't like admitting he needs help." Hannah's lips quirked in a small smile. "Sounds about right." By nightfall, the cabin felt more secure, but the tension in the air remained. Logan stood by the window, his eyes scanning the tree line as if expecting an attack. "You're going to wear a hole in the floor," Max said, leaning against the wall. Logan ignored him. Max sighed, pushing off the wall and clapping a hand on Logan's shoulder. "You can't." Logan's shoulders stiffened, but he didn't reply. Later, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Hannah sat with her knees drawn to her chest, her gaze distant. Logan watched her from across the room, his chest tightening at the vulnerability in her expression. "You okay?" he asked softly. Hannah looked up, startled. "Yeah, just thinking." "About?" She hesitated, then said, "How everything changed so fast. A week ago, I was just trying to keep my head down. Now," she trailed off, shaking her head. Logan didn't press her. Instead, he said, "We'll get through this, one step at a time." Hannah met his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. For the first time that day, the tension eased, if only slightly. Chapter 13. The wind had picked up after nightfall, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth through the cabin's open window. Logan sat at the table, his broad shoulders hunched as he cleaned the silver dagger Max had given him. The rhythmic scrape of the cloth against the blade filled the silence, punctuated by the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards. Across the room, Hannah curled up on the couch, her knees tucked to her chest, and her gaze distant. The firelight flickered over her face, softening the sharp edges of her weariness. "Did you always live out here?" she asked suddenly, her voice breaking the quiet. Logan glanced up, surprised by the question. "No, the cabin belongs to Max. I've only used it a few times when things got messy." Hannah nodded, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of a blanket draped over her lap. "It's peaceful," she said, though her tone held a hint of irony. "For now," Logan muttered. Silence settled between them again, but this time it was less heavy. Hannah hesitated, then asked, "What about before? Where were you before all of this?" Logan paused, the dagger still in his hands. He didn't answer immediately, his eyes fixed on the fire. "Everywhere," he said finally. "I never stayed in one place for long." Hannah tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "Why not?" "Because it's easier that way," Logan replied, his voice quieter now. "Easier to keep people at a distance. No attachments, no distractions." "Sounds lonely," Hannah said softly. Logan met her gaze, the weight of her words hitting him harder than he expected. "It's safer," he said. "For who?" she asked, her voice laced with quiet defiance. Logan didn't answer, he couldn't. Instead, he set the dagger aside and leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "What about you?" he asked, changing the subject. "What did you do before all this?" Hannah hesitated, her fingers tightening on the blanket. "I worked at a library, mostly kept to myself." Logan raised an eyebrow. Doesn't sound like the kind of job that gets you tangled up with rogues. A bitter smile crossed her lips. It wasn't. But Marcus, he had a way of pulling people into his world. I didn't see it at first. Or maybe I didn't want to. Logan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. What made you leave? Hannah's gaze dropped to the floor. He wasn't the person I thought he was. He controlled everything. Where I went, who I talked to, what I wore, and when I tried to. She trailed off, her voice breaking. Logan's fists clenched at his sides. Did he hurt you? Hannah nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I didn't think I'd ever get away. But one day, he went too far, and I ran. Logan's chest tightened. Her quiet resilience, the way she spoke about her pain without letting it consume her, stirred something deep within him. You're stronger than you think, he said, his voice low but steady. Hannah met his gaze, her expression softening. And you're not as detached as you think, she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Before Logan could respond, the door creaked open, and Max stepped inside, his boots tracking dirt across the floor. He glanced between them, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly. Am I interrupting something? He asked, his tone casual but probing. No, Logan said quickly, standing and crossing the room. What's the update? Max smirked but didn't press. The rogues are regrouping. They're not going to let this go easily. Let them come, Logan said, his voice hardening. Max's smirk faded. That kind of thinking is going to get you killed, Kane. Or worse, her. Logan stiffened, but Max pressed on. You're too close to this. I can see it all over your face. You think you can protect her just because you want to, but you're not thinking clearly. I'm doing what needs to be done, Logan snapped. Are you? Max shot back. Are you letting your emotions cloud your judgment? The tension between them was palpable, the air thick with unspoken truths. Later, after Max had retreated to his room, Logan found himself standing outside on the porch, the cold night air biting at his skin. Hannah stepped outside, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. You okay? She asked. Logan didn't look at her. I've spent years keeping people at arm's length. It's easier that way. And now? She asked gently. Logan exhaled, his breath visible in the chilly air. Now I'm not so sure. Hannah stepped closer, her voice soft. You don't have to do this alone, Logan. You don't have to carry all of it by yourself. Her words lingered, sinking deep into the walls he'd built around himself. For the first time, Logan allowed himself to believe she might be right. And that terrified him. Chapter 14. The crisp morning air carried a faint chill, the forest alive with the soft rustle of leaves and the distant call of a crow. Logan stood in the clearing behind the cabin, his arms crossed over his chest as he watched Hannah struggle to hold the stance he had just demonstrated. Bend your knees more, Logan said, his tone firm but patient. Hannah exhaled sharply, adjusting her posture. Like this? Logan stepped closer, his sharp gaze sweeping over her form. Better. Now keep your hands up. If you're guarding your face, you won't take a direct hit. Wouldn't it be easier to just not get hit at all? She muttered. Logan's lips quirked in a faint smirk. That's the goal. But until you get faster, you need to learn how to minimize the damage. Hannah gave him a look but didn't argue. The morning had started early, Logan waking her with a terse announcement that they needed to work on her self-defense. Hannah had balked at first, still sore from the emotional and physical weight of the last few days, but the glint of determination in Logan's eyes had been impossible to ignore. Now, as she struggled to mimic his movements, she couldn't help but notice how effortless he made it look. His stance was solid, his movements fluid and precise. He didn't just know how to fight, he embodied it. What's next? She asked, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. Logan picked up a stick from the ground, tossing it from hand to hand. Next, we test your reflexes. Hannah arched an eyebrow. With a stick? Logan's grin was wolfish. Try to block me. It was an unfair challenge. Logan moved like the wind, the stick darting toward her from angles she couldn't anticipate. Focus, Logan said as she flinched away from another strike. Don't watch the stick. Watch me. Hannah's frustration bubbled over. That's easy for you to say. You've probably been doing this for years. Logan paused, his expression softening slightly. You're right, I have. But the only way to get better is to start somewhere. You're doing fine. His words, simple as they were, lit a small spark of determination in her chest. She took a deep breath and adjusted her stance. Again, she said. The session wore on, and though Hannah's arms ached and her movements were still clumsy, she began to feel a flicker of confidence. Logan, for all his gruffness, was a surprisingly patient teacher. Good, he said as she managed to deflect a strike aimed at her shoulder. Now step into it. Use their momentum against them. Hannah tried, and while the execution wasn't perfect, Logan nodded in approval. Not bad, he said. Not bad, she shot back, her tone teasing. That was incredible, and you know it. Logan chuckled, the sound low and warm. Don't get cocky. The moment of levity shattered when the wind shifted, carrying a scent that made Logan's entire body tense. Hannah, he said, his voice low, go inside. Now. What? Why? Now. The command in his voice sent a chill down her spine. She didn't argue, turning and hurrying toward the cabin. Logan scanned the tree line, his senses on high alert. The scent was faint but unmistakable. Rogue. The attack came swiftly. A lone rogue burst from the underbrush, its gaunt frame and wild eyes betraying its desperation. Logan met it head-on, his movements a blur of speed and precision. The fight was brutal, the rogue's claws raking against Logan's arms as he deflected its strikes. Hannah watched from the porch, her breath catching as Logan shifted slightly, his teeth elongating and his claws extending. He wasn't fully transforming, but the glimpse of his supernatural strength was enough to leave her awestruck and unnerved. With a final blow, Logan sent the rogue crashing to the ground, its body limp and lifeless. Are you okay? Hannah asked, as Logan approached the porch, his breathing heavy. Fine, he said, brushing past her and stepping inside. She followed, her heart racing. Logan, what was that? You... Not now, he said sharply, his tone brooking no argument. Hannah bit her lip, her frustration simmering beneath the surface. But she knew better than to push him when he was like this. Later, as Logan cleaned his wounds in the kitchen, Max returned, his expression grim. I've got news, Max said, dropping a folder onto the table. The rogues are regrouping, and they've found a way to track her. Logan's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. How? Max sighed. Marcus. He must have given them something tied to her. They're not just after her for leverage anymore. She's part of their plan. The weight of Max's words settled over the room, thick and suffocating. They haven't... Logan's jaw tightened. Then we take the fight to them. Max raised an eyebrow. Are you sure about that? Logan glanced at Hannah, who stood silently in the corner, her face pale but resolute. Yes, he said, I am. Chapter 14. The cabin was cloaked in uneasy silence as Max spread the contents of the folder across the table. Photographs, scribbled maps, and a list of names formed a grim mosaic of rogue activity. Logan stood over Max's shoulder, his sharp eyes scanning the evidence, while Hannah lingered near the fireplace, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. This isn't just a few rogues causing trouble, Max said, tapping a photo of a heavily scarred shifter. This is organized. Cade's got them working together, which means he's planning something big. Logan frowned. And Hannah's tied to it? Max nodded. The timing lines up. Marcus must have handed over something they needed, but they're still after her. My guess? She's a loose end, and Cade doesn't leave loose ends. Hannah's voice broke through the tension. I don't understand. How could I possibly be part of this? I didn't even know about Marcus's dealings until I left. Max glanced at Logan, his expression unreadable. She doesn't know, Logan sighed. Not everything. Hannah straightened, her jaw tightening. Maybe someone could start explaining then. Logan leaned against the edge of the table, his arms crossed as he faced her. Cade isn't just after you because of Marcus. There's something about you, your connection to Marcus, that they're using. We don't know what yet, but it's enough for them to keep hunting you. Hannah blinked, her breath catching. Something about me? Like what? Max cleared his throat. Rogues like Cade don't waste time. If you were just leverage, they'd have moved on the moment Marcus was out of the picture. The fact that they're still coming after you means there's something specific they need. Hannah's heart pounded. But I don't have anything. I left everything behind when I ran. Not everything, Logan said, his voice quieter. Hannah's gaze snapped to his, her chest tightening at the weight of his words. Max broke the silence, his tone brisk. Whatever it is, we need to figure it out before they get to her, and we don't have much time. Logan's jaw clenched. Do you have any leads on their movements? Max nodded, pointing to a circled area on the map. A few. They've been sighted near an abandoned factory on the edge of town. Could be a hideout or just a staging ground. Logan straightened. Then we start there. Hold on, Max said, his tone firm. Charging in blind won't do us any good. We need a plan. Logan shot him a look. We don't have time for a perfect plan. Every second we waste puts her at more risk. Hannah watched the exchange, her unease growing. The stakes were becoming clearer with every word, and while Logan's determination was comforting, it was also terrifying. Logan, she said, her voice trembling slightly. He turned to her, his expression softening. What is it? Are you sure you can stop them? She asked, her vulnerability cutting through the tension. Logan hesitated, then nodded. I'll do whatever it takes. Hannah wanted to believe him, but the weight of the unknown loomed large. She didn't doubt his strength. She'd seen it firsthand. But the odds felt impossibly stacked against them. The conversation shifted as Max began outlining potential strategies, but Hannah's focus drifted. She stepped outside, the cool night air washing over her as she stared up at the canopy of stars. She didn't hear Logan approach until he was standing beside her. You okay? He asked, his voice soft. Hannah shrugged, her arms wrapped around herself. I don't know. It's a lot to take in. Logan nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. It is. Hannah glanced at him, her voice quiet. Why are you doing this? Putting yourself in danger for me? Logan hesitated, the question striking deeper than he expected. Because I can't stand by and do nothing, he said finally. Not when I can help. Hannah searched his face, her chest tightening at the raw honesty in his eyes. Thank you, she said, the words simple but heavy with meaning. The moment stretched between them, fragile but charged. Logan's wolf stirred beneath his skin, the instinct to protect her growing stronger with every passing second. But with that instinct came fear. Fear that he was getting too close, that his feelings for her were becoming a liability. Max's warning echoed in his mind. You're too close to this, it's clouding your judgment. Logan forced himself to look away, breaking the spell. We should get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. Hannah nodded, her expression unreadable. Good night, Logan. Good night, he replied, his voice quieter now. As she stepped back inside, Logan stayed on the porch, his gaze lingering on the stars. He'd made his choice. There was no turning back. Chapter 15. The forest was alive with the sounds of dusk. Chirping crickets, the soft rustle of leaves, and the distant hoot of an owl. But inside the cabin, tension weighed heavy, pressing against the walls like an invisible storm. Logan stood near the fireplace, his gaze fixed on the flames. He hadn't spoken in minutes, his jaw tight as if holding back words that would change everything. Hannah, seated at the table, broke the silence. You're hiding something. Logan's shoulders tensed, but he didn't turn. You've been hiding something since the day I met you, she continued, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. I don't need all the details, but I need to know the truth. Logan exhaled slowly, the firelight casting shadows across his face. The truth isn't going to make this easier, Hannah. It's not supposed to be easy, she said, rising to her feet, but I deserve to know what I'm caught up in. Logan turned to face her, his eyes dark and unreadable. You already know the important parts. Cade wants you. The rogues will do anything to get to you. My job is to make sure that doesn't happen. That's not what I'm asking, she said, taking a step closer. You're different. The way you move, the way you fight. She hesitated, then added, What are you, Logan? His chest tightened. He'd spent years keeping his nature hidden from people like her, from the world beyond his pack. To admit the truth felt like stripping away a part of himself he wasn't ready to share. I'm someone who's trying to keep you alive, he said finally, his voice low but steady. Hannah's frustration flared. Why won't you just tell me? What are you so afraid of? Of what you'll think, Logan snapped, his voice harsher than he intended. Hannah blinked, her breath catching. Logan closed his eyes briefly, reining in the frustration that wasn't truly aimed at her. Before either of them could speak again, the wind outside shifted, carrying with it a scent that made Logan's wolf stir. Stay here, Logan ordered, moving toward the door. What is it? Hannah asked, following him. Trouble, he said, his tone clipped. He stepped outside, his senses on high alert. The shadows between the trees seemed darker, the air thicker. He scanned the perimeter, his sharp eyes catching movement at the edge of the clearing. A low growl rumbled from his chest as 3 figures emerged, their gaunt frames and wild eyes gleaming in the fading light. Rogues. The first rogue lunged, its claws slashing through the air. Logan met it head-on, his movements swift and precise. His fist connected with the rogue's jaw, sending it crashing to the ground. The second and third attacked in unison, their feral snarls filling the night. Logan dodged one and grappled with the other, his strength undeniable. From the doorway, Hannah watched in stunned silence. Logan moved with an intensity she'd never seen before, his sheer power both mesmerizing and terrifying. When one rogue managed to land a blow, raking its claws across Logan's arm, a guttural snarl erupted from him. For a moment, his features shifted, his eyes glowing, his teeth elongating. Hannah's heart stopped. Logan dispatched the last rogue with a forceful blow, its lifeless body crumpling to the ground. He stood in the clearing, his chest heaving, his fists clenched. Hannah, he said, turning toward her. But the look on her face stopped him cold. You're not human, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Logan's chest tightened. I wanted to tell you, he said, his voice raw, but I didn't know how. What are you? She asked, her gaze searching his. Logan hesitated, then said, a shifter, a werewolf. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Hannah sank onto the porch step, her hands trembling. This whole time, everything I've seen, it makes sense now. I wanted to protect you, Logan said, stepping closer. I still do. Hannah looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of awe and fear. But how am I supposed to trust you after this? Logan's chest ached at her words. Because I've done everything I can to keep you safe, and I'll keep doing it, no matter what it takes. Hannah studied him, her expression softening slightly. Then don't hide anything from me, again, she said, her voice steadier now. Logan nodded. You have my word. As they returned to the cabin, Logan knew that everything had changed. The rogues were getting bolder, their attacks more coordinated. And now that Hannah knew the truth, the bond between them felt both stronger and more fragile than ever. For the first time, Logan allowed himself to hope that she might not just survive this fight, but stand by his side to win it. Chapter 16. The morning light filtered through the dense canopy of trees surrounding the cabin, casting dappled shadows across the weathered floor. Logan stood by the kitchen counter, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he had no intention of drinking. The events of the previous night weighed on him. Hannah's confrontation, the rogue attack, and, most behind him, Hannah sat at the small table, her fingers idly tracing patterns in the wood grain. She hadn't said much since their exchange, her quiet contemplation an unsettling contrast to the chaos they had endured. "I'm still processing," she said finally, breaking the silence. Logan glanced at her, his expression guarded. "That makes two of us." Hannah met his gaze, her eyes steady. "You've been protecting me from something I didn't even know existed. That's not lost on me." Logan's chest tightened at her words. "I told you the truth because you deserve to know what you're up against. But that doesn't mean it's going to get easier." "It hasn't been easy from the start," Hannah said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Later, Logan led her outside to the clearing behind the cabin. The air was crisp, the smell of pine and damp earth filling Hannah's lungs as she followed him. "If you're going to survive this, you need to be prepared," Logan said, his tone all business. Hannah raised an eyebrow. "More self-defense lessons?" "Something like that," Logan replied, gesturing toward the logs and rocks he had arranged in a makeshift obstacle course. "It's not just about fighting. It's about instincts, endurance, and knowing when to run." "Run?" she asked, crossing her arms. "Sometimes, survival means knowing when to fight and when to get the hell out of there," Logan said, his lips quirking into a faint smirk. Hannah sighed but moved into position as Logan directed. The training was grueling. Logan pushed her harder than the day before, testing not only her physical limits but also her mental resolve. "Keep your focus," he said as she stumbled over a log. "I'm trying," she shot back, her voice laced with frustration. "Trying isn't enough," Logan said, his tone firm. "You need to stay sharp even when you're tired." Hannah glared at him but didn't argue. She adjusted her stance, her determination flickering through the exhaustion. As the morning stretched on, Logan noticed a change in her. Hannah's movements became more fluid, her reactions quicker. When he threw a feint, she anticipated it, dodging before he could land the blow. "Better," Logan said, a hint of approval in his voice. "Better?" Hannah panted, her hands on her knees. "I'd call it impressive," Logan chuckled, the sound low and warm. "Don't get cocky." Their quiet moment was shattered by the sound of Max's Jeep pulling up. Logan's demeanor shifted instantly, his sharp gaze cutting toward the noise. Max climbed out, his expression grim as he approached. "We've got a problem." "What now?" Logan asked, his voice laced with tension. Max handed him a folded piece of paper. "Intercepted communication. Cade's pushing his rogues harder. He's desperate to finish whatever he's started. And your girl here is still at the center of it." Hannah stiffened at Max's words, but didn't flinch away. "What does he want with her?" Logan demanded, his voice edged with a growl. Max shrugged. "That's what we need to figure out. But we don't have much time. They're regrouping, and it's only a matter of time before they find us again." Hannah stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling beneath the surface. "Then let's stop waiting. If they're after me, I should be part of figuring out why." Max raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed by her resolve. "She's got guts, I'll give her that, she's right," Logan said, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "But it's not just about figuring this out, it's about staying alive while we do." Hannah nodded. "I'm ready." Logan couldn't help but feel a swell of admiration for her. Despite everything, she wasn't backing down. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the three of them huddled around the table inside, poring over maps and notes Max had gathered. For the first time, Logan felt the fragile beginnings of a partnership forming. Hannah wasn't just a passenger to protect anymore. She was a partner in survival, and that realization scared him more than he cared to admit. Chapter 17. The abandoned factory loomed in the moonlight like a skeletal beast, its rusted beams and shattered windows giving it an air of desolation. Logan crouched in the shadows with Max at his side, their eyes scanning the perimeter. The faint breeze carried the acrid scent of oil and something darker, rogue shifters. Hannah stayed behind, hidden in the Jeep a safe distance away, as much for her protection as Logan's peace of mind. "Smells like a trap," Max muttered, his voice barely audible. Logan nodded. "It is. But we need to know what they're planning." Max's expression hardened. "Don't let this become personal, Kane. Focus on the mission." Logan didn't respond. He couldn't, because no matter how much he tried to compartmentalize, this was personal. The two moved in sync, their steps silent as they crept toward the factory's side entrance. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of decay and damp concrete. Faint voices echoed from deeper within. There were words indistinct, but laced with malice. Logan's senses sharpened, his wolf straining against the boundaries of his human form. He held, "They're in the main room," Logan whispered. Max nodded, his grip tightening on the silver dagger he carried. "We're not walking out of here unnoticed. Be ready." They slipped into the shadows of the main room, where a group of rogues stood around a table scattered with maps and weapons. At the center was a man who exuded power, his scarred face illuminated by a single hanging bulb. Cade. Logan's jaw tightened at the sight of him. The rogue alpha radiated arrogance, his every movement a calculated display of dominance. "We move at dawn," Cade was saying, his voice low but commanding. "The girl is the key. Without her, Kane and his pack have nothing." Logan stiffened. His worst fears were confirmed. Hannah wasn't just a target. She was a linchpin in whatever scheme Cade was orchestrating. Before Logan could retreat, Cade's head snapped up, his glowing eyes locking onto the shadows where they hid. "Come out, Kane," Cade called, his tone mocking. "We've been expecting you." Max swore under his breath. "We're blown." Logan stepped into the light, his expression cold and unreadable. "You've got my attention, Cade. Now let her go." Cade chuckled, the sound devoid of humor. "She was never yours to keep. But you already knew that, didn't you?" Logan's fists clenched. "You're making a mistake." "Am I?" Cade said, spreading his arms. "Look around, Kane. You walked right into my den." The ambush came fast and brutal. Rogues poured from the shadows, their snarls echoing through the cavernous room. Logan and Max moved as one, their years of experience evident in every strike and dodge. Claws slashed through the air, the metallic scent of blood mingling with the acrid stink of the rogues. Logan's focus was unshakable, his alpha strength turning the tide of the battle. But for every rogue they took down, another seemed to appear, their numbers overwhelming. Outside, Hannah sat in the Jeep, her heart pounding as the faint sounds of the fight reached her ears. She clenched her fists, her mind racing with images of Logan and Max outnumbered and outmatched. "Stay here," Logan had said. "No matter what you hear, don't move." But she couldn't just sit there, not when their lives were on the line. Grabbing the small knife Max had given her earlier, she slipped out of the Jeep and crept toward the factory. Inside, the battle reached its breaking point. Logan's breath came in ragged gasps, his muscles burning as he fought off another rogue. Max was at his side, blood staining his shirt but his movements still precise. "You're losing, Kane," Cade taunted, stepping closer. "You can't protect her. You never could." Logan growled, his wolf surging to the surface. "Watch me." With a burst of strength, Logan launched himself at Cade, their bodies colliding with a force that shook the ground. Hannah reached the main room just as Logan and Cade clashed. Her eyes widened at the chaos, the blood, the snarling rogues, and Logan, his movements almost inhuman as he fought. She didn't think. She acted. Spotting a rogue creeping toward Logan's back, she lunged, her knife slashing through the air. The rogue howled as the blade connected, its attention snapping to her. Logan turned, his heart lurching at the sight of her. In the split second it took for Logan to react, Cade struck, his claws raking across Logan's chest. Logan staggered but didn't fall, his rage fueling him as he delivered a crushing blow to Cade's jaw. Max appeared at Hannah's side, dragging her back toward the exit. "You're either brave or stupid," he muttered, his tone a mix of frustration and grudging respect. "Maybe both," Hannah shot back, her voice trembling but resolute. Logan barely managed to hold off the rogues as Max and Hannah retreated. When he finally broke free, his body battered but unbowed, he followed them into the night. The factory faded behind them, but Cade's mocking laughter lingered in Logan's ears. "You can't run forever, Kane," Cade had said. "I'll find you, and when I do, she'll wish she never trusted you." Back at the Jeep, Logan turned to Hannah, his expression a mix of anger and worry. "What were you thinking?" "I couldn't just sit there," she said, her voice trembling. "You needed help." Logan exhaled sharply, his frustration melting into something softer. "You scared the hell out of me." Hannah looked at him, her eyes steadied despite the fear still coursing through her. "You're not the only one willing to fight." Logan's chest tightened. In that moment, he saw her not as someone to protect, but as someone standing beside him. "Let's get out of here," Max said, breaking the moment. "We've got bigger problems now." As the Jeep roared to life, Logan's resolve hardened. Cade had made this personal, but he wasn't about to lose. Not Hannah, not this fight. Chapter 18. The cabin's interior was dimly lit, the soft glow from the fireplace casting long shadows on the wooden walls. Max stood by the table, his expression grim as he spread out another set of documents. Logan leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his jaw tight. Hannah lingered near the window, her gaze flicking between the two men. "The rogues are targeting more than just Hannah," Max began, his voice low. "They're going after people connected to you, Logan. Members of your pack, your past alliances. Anyone they can use as leverage." Logan straightened, his sharp eyes narrowing. "Why now?" Max tapped a photograph on the table, a grainy image of a smiling woman standing with a young boy. "Because Cade knows your vulnerabilities. He's not just hunting people at random. He's using their connections to you to weaken your resolve." Hannah moved closer, her voice trembling. "Why would they care about me? I don't have any ties to this world." "You do," Max said, his tone gentler now. "Through Marcus. Whatever he was involved in, it's tied to the rogue's plans. And now, by association, so are you." Logan pushed away from the counter, pacing as his frustration boiled over. "Damn it, Max, if they're targeting my pack, someone should have seen this coming. We have protocols for this." Max sighed. "There's more. We've got a leak. Someone inside the pack is feeding them intel." Logan froze, his entire body going rigid. "A traitor?" Max nodded. "It's the only explanation for how they've stayed one step ahead of us. Cade isn't smart enough to pull this off on his own. He's getting help." Logan's fists clenched. The thought of someone betraying the pack, betraying him, made his wolf stir with fury. Hannah stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension. "Then we need to figure out who it is. If the rogues are using me as bait, maybe we can turn the tables on them." Logan turned to her, his expression softening despite the storm brewing in his chest. "Hannah, this isn't your fight." She shook her head. "It is now. I'm not going to sit back and let them keep coming after me. I want to help." Max raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Brave words, but do you even know what you're signing up for?" Hannah met his gaze, her chin lifting. "No, but I'm not afraid to find out." Max let out a low whistle, his expression a mix of amusement and approval. "She's got guts, I'll give her that." Logan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "This isn't about guts, it's about survival." "And survival means working together," Hannah said firmly. "You can't do this alone, Logan, and I can't keep running forever, so let me help." Logan studied her, his sharp features softening as he saw the determination in her eyes. Despite the fear she must have felt, she stood her ground, unshaken. "Fine," Logan said finally, his voice gruff. "But you follow my lead, no exceptions." Hannah nodded. "Deal." The three of them spent the next few hours poring over the information Max had gathered. The rogue network was more expansive than Logan had feared, with connections that stretched far beyond Cade's immediate circle. As they worked, Hannah began to piece together fragments of the werewolf world, its hierarchy, its rules, and its vulnerabilities. "So, you're an alpha," she said, glancing at Logan. "That means—" "What exactly?" Logan hesitated, his gaze flicking to Max before answering. "It means I'm responsible for the pack. Their safety, their decisions, it all falls on me." Hannah frowned. "That's a lot of weight to carry." Logan's lips quirked into a faint, humorous smile. "It comes with the territory." By the time the fire burned low, the three of them had a plan. Max would dig deeper into the traitor's identity, while Logan and Hannah worked to intercept the rogue's next move. As Max headed to his room, Logan and Hannah lingered by the fire. The crackling flames cast flickering light across their faces, the silence between them thick, but not uncomfortable. "You meant what you said earlier," Logan said, breaking the quiet. Hannah looked at him, her brow furrowed. "About helping?" He nodded. "Yeah," she said softly. "I'm tired of being a victim, Logan. If there's a way to fight back, I want to take it." Logan's chest tightened. He'd spent so much time trying to keep her at arm's length, but in this moment he realized she wasn't just someone to protect. She was someone willing to stand beside him. "Then we fight," Logan said, his voice steady. "Together?" Hannah's lips curved into a small, determined smile. "Together." Chapter 19. The fire crackled softly, its light dancing across the room. Max stood by the window, arms crossed and gaze fixed on the dark forest beyond. His presence felt like a storm brewing, heavy with tension and unspoken truths. Logan sat at the edge of the table, his expression unreadable but his posture tense. "You can't keep doing this," Max said finally, his voice low and sharp. Logan didn't respond immediately, his jaw tightening as he stared into the flames. "Mean it, Kane," Max continued, turning to face him. "You're either in this fight all the way, or you're not. And if you're not, you need to step aside and let someone else take the reins." Logan looked up, his sharp eyes narrowing. "I've been in this fight since the beginning, Max." "No, you've been reacting," Max shot back. "You've been letting them dictate the terms while you scramble to keep up. That's not leading, Logan, that's surviving." The words hit harder than Logan wanted to admit. He leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "You think I don't know what's at stake here? My pack, Hannah, they're all I think about." "Then start acting like it," Max said, his tone softening but his gaze no less piercing. "You're the alpha. Your pack looks to you for direction. Right now, they're seeing a man who's torn between his responsibilities and his fears." Logan flinched, but Max didn't relent. "Make a choice, Kane," Max said, "because if you don't, someone else will." Hannah lingered in the doorway, her arms crossed as she listened. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but Max's words carried through the quiet cabin. When Max left the room, giving Logan space to think, she stepped forward. "Is that really how you see yourself?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. Logan looked at her, surprise flickering in his eyes. "What do you mean?" "You're so afraid of making the wrong decision that you're not making any decisions at all," Hannah said, moving closer. "But that's not the man I've seen. You've been protecting me, fighting for your pack, standing up to Cade. That doesn't sound like someone who's afraid to lead." Logan exhaled, his shoulders sagging slightly. "It's not that simple, Hannah. Every choice I make puts lives at risk. If I screw this up—" "Then you'll pick up the pieces and keep going," she interrupted, "because that's what leaders do." Her words settled over him like a balm and a challenge all at once. Logan studied her, seeing not just her determination, but the quiet strength that had carried her through everything they'd faced. "You think I'm capable of more than this?" Logan asked, his voice quieter now. "I know you are," Hannah said, her gaze unwavering. The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable, a moment of understanding that neither of them needed to put into words. Later, Logan found Max outside, leaning against the Jeep and smoking a cigarette. "You're right," Logan said without preamble. Max raised an eyebrow, exhaling a plume of smoke. "About what?" "About everything," Logan admitted. I've been holding back because I'm afraid of what happens if I fail, but that's not an excuse anymore." Max studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Good, because we're running out of time, Kane. The rogues aren't going to wait for you to figure this out." "They won't have to," Logan said, his voice firm. "I'm ready." As the night deepened, Logan returned to the cabin, his mind clearer than it had been in weeks. Hannah looked up as he entered, her expression a mix of curiosity and hope. "What's next?" she asked. Logan stepped closer, his voice steady. "We stop running. We take the fight to them." Hannah's lips curved into a small, determined smile. "I'm with you." For the first time, Logan allowed himself to believe that they could win. Not just against Cade, but against the doubts that had plagued him for so long. Chapter 20. The warehouse was eerily silent as Logan and his team moved through its shadowed corridors, the faint scent of rogue shifters lingering in the air. Logan led the way, his every sense on high alert, with Max and a few trusted pack members flanking him. Hannah, against his better judgment, stayed close behind, her resolve unwavering despite the tension crackling in the air. "Keep quiet," Logan murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're close." Hannah nodded, clutching the small blade Max had handed her. The weapon felt insignificant in her hand, but she gripped it tightly, determined not to be a liability. They reached the main chamber, where faint murmurs echoed from the far side. Logan crouched low, motioning for the others to do the same. Ahead, a group of rogues huddled around a makeshift cage where several captives huddled, their faces pale and terrified. "Captives," Max muttered. "Cade's been busy." Logan's jaw tightened. "We're ending this now." The attack was swift and calculated. Logan and his team burst into the chamber, their movements a blur of precision and power. Hannah hung back as instructed, but her heart raced as the scene unfolded. Logan took down the first rogue with a bone-crunching blow, his claws glinting in the dim light. Max fought beside him, his blade flashing as he moved with practiced ease. The pack members joined the fray, their strength and coordination overwhelming the rogues. Hannah's breath caught as she saw Logan in action. He wasn't just fighting, he was commanding, his presence a force that seemed to steady everyone around him. The battle ended almost as quickly as it had begun. The rogues lay defeated, their bodies strewn across the chamber. The captives were freed, their grateful tears mingling with the faint sobs of relief. Logan stood at the center of the room, his chest heaving as he surveyed the scene. For the first time in days, a flicker of hope sparked in his chest. "It's over," Max said, wiping blood from his blade. Logan nodded, his gaze shifting to Hannah. "We did it." Hannah smiled, the expression small but genuine. "You did it," she said, her voice filled with admiration. The moment was short-lived. A slow clap echoed through the chamber, freezing everyone in place. Logan turned sharply, his wolf surging to the surface as Cade emerged from the shadows, his grin a sharp, predatory thing. "Well done, Kane," Cade drawled, his voice laced with mockery. "But you should know by now, this is far from over." Logan stepped forward, his claws flexing. "You've lost, Cade. Your rogues are done." Cade chuckled darkly. "You think this was my army? My plan?" He gestured around the room. "This was a distraction, Kane. While you were busy playing hero, my real forces were moving into position." Logan's chest tightened, the weight of Cade's words sinking in. "What are you talking about?" Logan demanded, his voice a growl. Cade's grin widened. "You'll find out soon enough. Let's just say your pack and your precious human are about to find themselves in a very precarious position." Before Logan could strike, Cade disappeared into the shadows, his mocking laughter lingering in the air. The chamber fell silent, the weight of the encounter settling over the group like a storm cloud. Max stepped beside Logan, his expression grim. "We need to get back. Now." Logan nodded, his gaze flicking to Hannah. Her resolve hadn't wavered, but he could see the flicker of fear in her eyes. "Let's move," Logan said, his voice sharp. As they drove back to the cabin, the fleeting sense of victory was replaced by a gnawing dread. Cade's words replayed in Logan's mind, each one a reminder of how much was at stake. Hannah sat beside him, her fingers clutching the edge of the seat. "What do you think he meant?" she asked quietly. Logan's grip on the wheel tightened. "Whatever it is, it's worse than anything we've seen so far." Hannah placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. "We'll face it. Together." Logan glanced at her, his chest tightening. Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that steadied him. "We will," Logan said, his voice firm. "No matter what it takes. Thank you for joining us on this thrilling journey so far. But trust me, the story is far from over. The twists, the revelations, and the emotions are only just beginning to unravel. You don't want to miss what happens next. It's where the narrative truly comes alive." Continue this adventure seamlessly by heading to the next part of the audiobook, where the story deepens and the stakes get even higher. Click the link in the description to dive straight in. Don't wait, your next chapter awaits, and you won't want to miss a single moment of it.